the beginning of Ethereum is a fascinating kind of moment because if you think about, Wikipedia as, hey, a group of people on the internet can make knowledge, and then Bitcoin is a group of people and a group of computers can sort of crowdsource a foundation for money. The big innovation with Ethereum was not just money, but also logic and programs and contracts. And so there's this notion of a smart contract in as like a program basically on Ethereum that is anybody can program against, anybody can see. And if you think about sort of Wikipedia collapsing the sort of process steps of delivering knowledge to the world, and Bitcoin collapsing all the intermediate steps of making financial transactions, like Ethereum sort of does the same thing with logic and contracts. And now, of course, almost 10 years later, I guess 10 years later, this notion of smart contracts and all the things that you can do with them is very well understood. But back then, I think it was maybe a little bit less
No,
obvious.
I mean, nobody thought it would work. I mean, this is a thing too. Like, I'm very happy to like hop in and be fully committed when
no one thinks it's going to work.
Nobody thinks it's going to work at all. Yeah, I mean, but Ethereum really drew from a lot of great thoughts that were in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and people wanted to build it into Bitcoin. I think that Bitcoin has always had more of a conservative, hey, this is working, let's not change it bent, which is healthy. And I think it took years for them to kind of solidify in that. And a bunch of the early Bitcoiners that wanted to try this out needed to basically fork Bitcoin. And so there were some early attempts to do that, or early ways to extend it. And Vitalik and the rest of the early developers realized they needed to kind of start from scratch. But the big idea with Ethereum has really been always about coordination, more than anything else. So having like a shared global state where you can run computer programs, that's a big idea. And that's something that many folks were fascinated with. And the most fascinating area in Ethereum for me was this notion of a DAO.
And I don't from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I mean, the idea of a DAO really started in 2013 with this early Bitcoiner named Dan Larimer. He's gone on to do a bunch of other projects, but he was thinking about how can we not just use Bitcoin or a Bitcoin-like system to represent Bitcoins, but other assets as well. And so there was a notion that you could color Bitcoins, and that didn't really work, and you needed something like Ethereum to really make it work.
Maybe help us connect the dots between the idea of a DAO and the idea of new assets, because they're related, but maybe not obvious how.
Well, I mean, so what a blockchain is great because for the first time, you really have like a shared data structure that everybody can look to and verify and say something happened.
Universally, across the whole
internet. And that sounds really basic, but it's really important. If you think about how we coordinate, we need to establish some ground truths. And one of the ground truths that often gets established in an organization is who owns what, right? If we're going to work together, you're probably not going to want to work as hard if I own 100% of it. So we're going to divide up the ownership. Maybe we need some capital, so we're going to give it to a venture capitalist, right? So that we can get moving. But we need to know who owned what. And so you need a neutral, shared global state to do that. And Ethereum proved to be one of the early, and I think will ultimately become that neutral layer kind of for the internet across the board.
And so if you think of a DAO as a structure that a group of people coordinating around a project can use, it's fundamentally tied to the ownership graph, among that group. Basically.
Completely. So it's ownership. And then the second thing that it really does well is, it's a monetary system, right? And so Bitcoin's a monetary system. I think in the long run, we're going to see that Ethereum's a competing monetary system, and there may be some others, but you now have an asset that you can put in a bank account. And so you can't have an organization without a bank account, right? I mean, you can, but it doesn't work that well, even for not-for-profit, right? Like you need some operating capital. So early DAOs, I think they had the feeling of being like an online group, but they also had this shared bank account with them. And again, really simple concept, but really powerful, because once you have like a shared bank account, you could try to make that bank account bigger, right? You could grant that out and give that away in like a more public service type oriented way. You could, figure out different ways to allocate that capital to pay for work if that's helpful. So all these types of like new modalities began to emerge for online groups, and that's super interesting. And then the third thing you can do with Ethereum is that you can program who has access to that capital, or you can also play around with how we're going to make decisions related to it. So if you own part of the business or part of the organization and I own part of the organization, we can maybe say we want a third party to vote on our behalf, and we can play around with all these different dynamics on how organizations operate. And that's the fun part. It's all programmable, so you have this sandbox of governance that you can play around with too, which
sounds a lot like
really
the very
fun.
Beginning of our conversation about the corporate form, and being able to structure people together around ownership, around governance, around rules. Same basic idea, except that now on a very different substrate that has no paperwork, is global.
Ideally would have no paperwork.
Right, there is still
hard to get rid of paperwork.
Yeah,
but I think it's like almost Wikipedia all the way down, right? Wikipedia was great, but there was no way to compensate people for it, right? And a lot of people work very hard on Wikipedia, and they received like internal status in the group, but maybe they should have had a place where this could be their full-time job, right? And so I think even some of the early great examples of online communities working together, they didn't have this like monetary ownership, like shared state that really would enable all those ecosystems to grow a lot more.
Right. And so, basically Wikipedia showed us that you could have online groups, but you could connect them socially and maybe via information, but you couldn't really connect them natively in a ownership and compensation incentive model. And that's what blockchains have built in, and Ethereum in particular really leaned into.
Ethereum definitely they picked it up from Bitcoin, like early Bitcoiners. They've leaned into it. But in the Ethereum ecosystem, we attribute, that's what we're trying to lean in the most. So lots of people have talked about this. Lots of the great parts about blockchain tech is there's been a lot of really interesting ideation. It kind of has like its roadmap set out, but people need to pick up that work and really kind of build out that future. And so we're doing our best to kind of do that in the DAO space.